بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa ta'ala wa barakatuhu. Dear beloveds, nice to be with you again. So today I'll be talking about the extrapolating more about the ma'rifah of Allah from Shaykh Ibrahim's Tafsir, and particularly this notion that we've been talking a lot about the Dhatullah, the essence of God, the attributes of God, the works of God. So explaining this a bit further, how it is that the knowledge of God is necessary at these three different levels, that we have knowledge of God's works, we have knowledge of God's attributes, and we have knowledge of God's essence. And of course, not all of them are at the same level. Not all of them are as easy to acquire. But for Shaykh Ibrahim Niyas, that all of them are necessary. So I guess the place to start today is just with Kul Huwallahu Ahad. And I know this has been referenced before, but reminders are always good to hear things more and more. Repetition is not exclusive of further contemplation, and in fact helps it. So Shaykh Ibrahim, what does he say about Ikhlas? I'm not going to go through the full tafsir of Ikhlas, but he says, he's talking about this narration that reading from the Prophet ﷺ, that the Surah Ikhlas is 1/3 of the whole Quran, right? So what does he say? He says, let's look at my iPad here. Man qara al-Ikhlas ثلاث مرات Shaykh Ibrahim's Tafsir فإنما ختم القرآن ووجه ذلك أن القرآن جاء لمعرفة الله تبارك وتعالى ومعرفة الله في أفعاله وصفاته وذاته وكل هو الله أحد تضمنت من معرفة الذات ما لم تضمنت سورة غيرها. So the reason why Ikhlas is 1/3 of the Quran, Shaykh Ibrahim says, is that the Quran came to bring people the knowledge of Allah, the Ma'rifah. Exalted and majestic is He. And the knowledge of God is found in His works, His attributes, and His essence. So Kul Huwallahu Ahad, say He is God the One, includes knowledge of the divine essence that is not included elsewhere. And so he goes on to say that, actually, Kul Huwallahu Ahad, just the first line here, is a reference to three spiritual stations of all humankind with God, right? The first one are those that are muqarrabun, the intimate with God, those that are brought near, and for them, this is they are referred to by He, when mentioned, like. They have knowledge of God at He, and those on the Ashab al-Yamin, those on God's right hand, or those who are saved, they are the people that they relate to the name Allah, and those who relate to the name Ahad are those on Ashab al-Shamal, those that are in the hellfire, or they are the deniers of God, right? And so he says, well, the Gnostics, Muqarribun and the Arifun, those that are brought near to God, and those that have knowledge of God, God is not absent, he says, from their hearts for a moment. So when Huwa, He is mentioned, there cannot be any other being except for Him, right? So they know right away that this is mentioning that there is no one else to be mentioned except God. The commonality of believers, maybe they forget sometimes when Allah is mentioned, they remember what their purpose is and who their Lord is. And those who deny the existence of God or assign Him partners, the only thing to say to them is that Kul Huwallahu Ahad, He's the one, He's the unique, right? He's different than whatever else you think He is. And so in terms of the expression of Tawheed, of the oneness of God here, although Shaykh Ibrahim is breaking down the different types of Tawheed, the oneness of God's essence, the oneness of God's attributes, and the oneness of God's actions. He does make the point in this tafsir. He says, quote, he is one in his essential being. ذاته واسمائه وصفاته وافعاله. He is one in his essential being, his names, his attributes, and his works. Okay, so mentioned in the beginning of these discussions with about the Riyadh Tafsir that Shaykh Ibrahim is actually drawing upon a lot of different sources. I mentioned some of them already. Ahmed Sawi, Hashiyat al-Sawi ala Tafsir Jalalain, mentioned Ruh al-Bayan. But this idea is very old, of course. Arguably, it relates to from the Quran and Sunnah itself. But it's Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, the famous Hujjat al-Islam, who dies in 1111 of the Common Era, that is mostly credited with developing this idea, particularly in relationship to the Quran. So the place to look for this is this book called Jawahir al-Quran, The Jewels of the Quran. Has been translated by some early Orientalists. And so the translation that I'm reading to you is based upon that of Arbery, but it's also, I think it was Arbery, I don't remember. But it's also based upon the original Arabic, which you can also find as a PDF online. So this is what Al-Ghazali says about, and basically what the Jewels of the Quran is Jawahir al-Quran is a system, an elaborate system of classifying the different ayahs, basically giving you a map, a schema by which you can organize the various Quran verses in your head, right? So when Allah is talking about something that he did, or a promise or a warning, that you can kind of, it clicks something in your head where you realize, okay, this is how I should be. This is a certain type of a verse, and I should be responding in a certain way, right? But the first thing that he wants to talk about is the knowledge of God, right? That the knowledge of God is the most important thing, just like Shaykh Ibrahim says, that the Quran was revealed to teach, right? Teaching humanity about the knowledge of God. So this is how he talks about it. He says the first type of Quran verses concerns the description of the one to whom mankind is called, right? It is the explanation of the knowledge, the ma'rifah of Allah. In it is the rarest of red sulfur, right? Kabrit al-Ahmar. This is an old idea in Sufi thought. Ibn Arabi, of course, talks about it quite a bit, but you can see it earlier here with Al-Ghazali. So he says this knowledge, the Kabrit al-Ahmar, is itself of three types: the knowledge of the reals, the Dhat al-Haq, right? The knowledge of the real's essential being, the knowledge of his attributes, and knowledge of his works. These three types can be called sapphires because they are precious benefits derived from the rarest of red sulfur. And just as sapphires, he's using the word yawakit, rubies, right, have grades, among them are rubies, meaning red yokut, light blue sapphires, and yellow sapphires. Some more valuable than others. So too are the three forms of knowledge of unequal rank. The most precious of them is the knowledge of Allah's essential being. And this could be called the ruby. And this is the knowledge of after this, is the knowledge of Allah's attributes. And this is the blue sapphire. And after this is the knowledge of Allah's works. And this is the yellow sapphire. So in Al-Ghazali's schema, then the ruby is the most precious. It's the most rare. The blue sapphire is also very precious, but is much more common. And the yellow sapphire is found everywhere, right? But it's still very precious. And so what Al-Ghazali does then is to kind of give you some examples of verses of the Quran that speak to Allah's essence, verses of the Quran that speak to his attributes, and to speak to his works. So what does he say about what are some of the verses that speak to Allah's essence? And he said these ones are, we can't really put the essential being into God's essential being into words. So the best thing that you can say, Lam yakul lahu kufuwan ahad, laysa kamithlihi shay, right? There's none like comparable to him. There's nothing like to him that comes in the Quran. And so these are basically, you know, the only way of telling you about Allah's essence is to, in fact, tell you what it's not, right? It's nothing, he's not comparable to anything that you can imagine. But then, of course, the speaking of Allah's attributes then have to do with the mention of the 99 divine names, mention of Allah's power, His will, His rahmah, His mercy, right? So these are all expressions of Allah's attributes, and of course they are much more widespread in the Quran, but still not as much as the yellow sapphires or the mention of God's works, which are basically found everywhere, right? And any mention of the creation, any mention of God, and how he has dealt with the previous generations, how he spoke to the previous prophets or revealed revelations to the previous prophets. These are all expressions for Al-Ghazali of God's works, right? And, you know, he has an interesting passage just included also, and he talks about God's works, and basically that many of the things that we are mentioned in the Quran, we don't have full knowledge of them, but just to kind of preserve some humility from the perspective of the servant in terms of God's works. He wants to tell you that when Allah says, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, for example, the Lord of all the worlds, that this is, you know, this is just one of many worlds that we are here in, right? So I have a daughter that's interested in science fiction things, so I read her this verse, and I read her this passage from Al-Ghazali. I'm about to read you now. She was very appreciative. So he says, do not consider it improbable that among the servants of Allah, there may be those who, preoccupied with glorifying Allah, have no knowledge of Adam and his descendants. Mankind should not magnify himself to such an extent. Truly, Al-Ghazali says, the Messenger of Allah said, surely Allah has a white earth where the rising and setting of the sun is of 30 days similar to the days of this world. It is filled with 30 times more creatures than this world. And they do not know that Allah has created Adam and Iblis. And Ibn Abbas narrates this tradition. And indeed, Al-Ghazali says the kingdom of Allah is expansive, right? So Al-Ghazali is basically suggesting here, based upon the hadith, that there are other worlds than this world, right? And so if you want to contemplate Allah's works, then also think about what you do not know, right? So in any case, back to what Shaykh Ibrahim is saying about the differentiation, he's definitely following this schema that posits the Dhatullah, the essence of God, as the most precious type of knowledge to obtain. But that also very important are the knowledge of God's attributes and the knowledge of God's works, right? And I was thinking about how to contemplate the relationship between these as if, you know, you have you are acquainted with, you know, a beautiful spouse or your lover, right? And this lover is existing behind, you know, he or she lives in a veiled environment, a closed room, and you are able to ask, you know, to get to see him or her. And there are those that, you know, are asking that they just want to have something that lover made for them, maybe some trinkets, maybe some desserts, some chocolates, to be sent out through the curtains so that they can eat it or play with this trinket, right? Now there are others that ask to go put their face in the curtain, right? To sit outside the curtain and to smell the beautiful perfume of their lover, right? And this would be like the person who is contemplating God through his attributes, right? The first person is like the one who is contemplating God through his works, right? Or appreciating, giving thanks to God through his works. But there's another person who wants to go draw back the veil and to go be acquainted with his or her lover directly. And if you are, you know, that lover, then of course, which of your lovers would you be more happy with, right? Which of your beloveds would you want to be more intimate with, right? The one who is content just with the trinkets you make for them and sits outside the curtain, the one who puts his face to the curtain but is not ready to go inside, or the one who leaves all of those other things and goes directly inside to be with you. And so this is one way of thinking about for Shaykh Ibrahim, how important it is to prioritize the knowledge of God's essential being while still being thankful and appreciative for and cognizant of Allah's oneness at the levels of his attributes and works. So just going to go through a couple other verses in the Quran that Shaykh Ibrahim uses to extrapolate this kind of tripartite discussion of the ma'rifah of Allah. And so one of them is in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 208. He says, what the Quran says, and among people are those who sell themselves, desiring the pleasure of Allah, and Allah is kind to his servants. So what he says about this verse, in addition to giving the regular asbab al-nuzul, he says it's necessary for the servant to surrender his wealth for Allah, his children for Allah, and his self for Allah. The one who sacrifices his wealth for Allah will attain the station of fana, or annihilation, in the works of Allah. He will come to know that there is no one in this existence who does anything other than Allah. Achieving annihilation in the works of Allah is the reward for the one who sacrifices his wealth for Allah. Right? The one who surrenders his children to Allah will obtain annihilation in the attributes of Allah. Right? It's because that your children, they say, as the walad sirul abi, right? The son is the secret of his father. The child is the secret of the parent. But your children are like your own attributes, right? So you being able to give up of your attributes for Allah's sake signifies your ability to recognize the relationship of Allah's attributes to his essence. And that will be explained further on. Says the one who surrenders his own self to Allah will obtain the station of annihilation in Allah's essential being. He will obtain the annihilation of his ego self and remain in that station by Allah, right? So you can have fana fi af'alihi, fana fi sifatihi, wa fana fi dhatihi, right? All are necessary, right, for Shaykh Ibrahim, right? So if you are surrendering your wealth to Allah, then you'll obtain knowledge, right? In other words, you cannot obtain knowledge of the oneness of Allah's works and be annihilated in the oneness of Allah's works unless you are willing to give up your wealth for Allah's sake, right? You cannot obtain the annihilation and the knowledge of Allah's attributes until you're willing to give up your children for the sake of Allah, right? You cannot obtain the knowledge of Allah's essence unless you're willing to give up yourself for the sake of Allah. And this is what I spoke about last time. The idea of annihilation of the self being the only way to obtain the true ma'rifah of Allah, because if you are existing in saying that Allah is existing, then you're lying, right? Because there are two in that scenario and Allah is only one. So Shaykh Ibrahim goes on another verse where he speaks about this, and Surah Al-Ali Imran, verse 95. Allah says, say Allah speaks the truth. So follow the upright creed of Ibrahim alayhi salam. He was not among the idolaters. He was not among the mushrikun, right? So Shaykh Ibrahim then uses the example of Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam to also teach this lesson, right? So he says, by fighting his ego self, in preventing it from its lustful desires, the seeker becomes a follower of the millat of Ibrahim, of the creed of Ibrahim. Allah has said the truth by stating that the one who spends everything he owns attains thereby the connection with Allah. Whoever is for Allah, then Allah is for him. So follow the creed of Ibrahim, the one who surrendered his wealth for the entertainment of guests, his child for sacrifice, and his self to the fire. right? So Shaykh Ibrahim is very truncated here, but he sort of expects you to know this larger story. So I'll relate the story to you now as it was explained to me by Sheikh Hassan Sisi. And he said, Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam was known as the Qutb of Iman, right? Meaning he was the only one of his time to have true upright faith, right? And then he taught it to his family. So on all of the earth at this time, then it's only Prophet Ibrahim that's holding up the true Tawheed. And that he had knowledge of Allah in his works, in his attributes, and in his essence, right? And so how did he have knowledge of Allah in his works? It is said that the angels, of course, the story of Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, after he was sort of expelled from his father's town and the kingdom of Nimrod, where he was living. And then he went out into the desert, but Allah gave him barakah, right? Even though he had left the dwellings and inhabitants of the people of his time, he went out into the arid regions, but Allah gave him barakah, and his children, his family, extended family multiplied, because he didn't have children himself until late, as you know. And his livestock multiplied, his wealth multiplied, until the angels started to have a discussion among themselves. Allah was hearing them. They say, and some of them were asking, can a prophet or a beloved of God have so much wealth, right? And so they were posing this question. And Allah, according to the story, Allah overheard them and said, well, if you want to test him, go ahead, right? So one angel says, okay, I will go test him. So angels, of course, wherever they go, they're making tasbih, subhanallah, alhamdulillah, etc., giving the glorifications of God as they move about. And so this angel is coming now to test Ibrahim alayhi salam. And as he's coming, Ibrahim alayhi salam hears the angel making tasbih, glorifying his Lord as he comes. And Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam is so excited, so happy to hear another person on the earth making the glorification of God, that he rushes out to meet this person, right? And he says, who are you? Because the angel's in disguise, right? Who are you that's making, is mentioning my Lord, right? Right away, here is half of my wealth. Just because you make tasbih, you mention my Lord, that I'm going to give you half of my wealth. And please say it one more time, and I will give you everything that I own. And if you say third time, you mention my Lord a third time, I myself will become your slave. Right? So then the angel left, saying there's no need to test Prophet Ibrahim salam, because he's willing to give up all of his wealth for Allah at a moment's notice. Okay? As for Prophet Ibrahim's salam, his knowledge of God's essence, of attributes, this was his ability to sacrifice his own child, right, for the sake of Allah, or to be willing to do so, and Allah saving Ismail at the last minute, or some say Ishaq. And as for his knowledge of Allah's essence, when Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam was put into the fire by Nimrod, right? And they said this fire was so hot, it was, people couldn't come within miles of this fire. It was so hot. And Allah sent an angel when Prophet Ibrahim, when the fire starts to get hot, starts to kindle around him. He sent an angel to the Prophet Ibrahim to ask him, did he need anything? The Prophet Ibrahim, according to the story, says, if you're an angel from your Lord, as for from you, I don't need anything from you. But the very fact that Allah knows of my condition is enough for me, right? So Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam is only relying on Allah's essence to save him. And that's when Allah says now, that the fire, be cool. So, and somebody has made tafsir, I heard, he said, kun bardan was salaman, right? So be cool and then in peace. They said the command to be cold actually was about to extinguish all the fires on earth. But when Allah added the word and in peace or in security, then normal fires could come back. Right? So that's, Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam in his extinction in Allah's works, his extinction in Allah's attributes, and extinction or annihilation in Allah's essence. Right, and so this is an Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam becomes an exemplar for the Gnostic to have, or the true muwahid, the true monotheist, to have true tawheed, true monotheism, or true knowledge of God, of God's oneness in each of these stations. Right? So this is actually a very productive tripartite distinction for Shaykh Ibrahim, and he brings it to bear in his discussion, even of dhikr, right? So I'll go through this verse of the Quran, also in Surah Al-Ali Imran, verse 190. Surely in the heavens and the earth, and in the alteration of the night and day, there are signs for those with understanding, who remember Allah standing and sitting, and on their sides, and contemplate the creation of the heavens and the earth. So I'm going to be jumping around with Shaykh Ibrahim's tafsir of this ayat is very long. So I'm actually going to start with the latter part first, when he's talking about, he starts to talk about the dhikr of Allah. And actually it's the contemplation of Allah that he talks about first. So I'm going to reverse it and talk about the dhikr. And how he relates it to this tripartite distinction of Allah's essence, his attributes, and his works. So he says, in the beginning, the remembrance of Allah, the dhikr, is performed with the tongue, then with the heart, and then with the spirit, the ruh. With the tongue's remembrance, there is found extinction or annihilation, fana, in Allah's works. With the heart's remembrance, there is found extinction in Allah's attributes. And it reminds me here, right, of course, extinction of Allah's works, because your tongue is, of course, the most important part of your limbs, right? Can either take you to paradise or take you to hellfire. So drowning that limb, that body part of yours in the remembrance of Allah, allows you to attain extinction in Allah's works. The heart itself is prone to rotating between the attributes of Allah, right? Like I said in the hadith, says the heart of the believer goes back and forth between the two fingers of Allah. And of course, the essential classification of Allah's attributes are between Jamal or Jamali and Jalali, right? Those attributes that are beautiful, subtle, right? And those that are majestic and powerful, right? And so this is the way, in fact, the word qalb, as you know from qalaba, it means to turn, right? So we are constantly engaged in this struggle to turn our heart back to God. But when we get it in God's presence through the remembrance, then we're going to find even that our heart itself is going to be, Allah is going to be moving it back and forth between different aspects of his attributes, depending upon the manifestation of God that we're meeting at that time, right? So that's an explanation of how the heart becomes, when the heart is drowned in God's remembrance, it becomes extinguished or annihilated in Allah's attributes, right? That is actually reflecting the diverse attributes that are meeting it at certain times. Shaykh Ibrahim continues, he said, annihilation upon annihilation upon annihilation. With the remembrance of the spirit is found the comprehensive extinction, right? The comprehensive annihilation. So he says, this means fana, ala fana, right? Or fana, minul fana. So extinction upon extinction upon extinction. And this annihilation is the essence of coming back to remain in the world, right? So the baqa. He says, and dhikr has a shell, a core, and a core of the core. The general folk have the shell, meaning the remembrance of the tongue. The elite have the core, the remembrance of the heart. The elite of the elite have the core of the core. And this is the oil, who is zayt, he says, right? So this is interesting. He seems to be referencing Surah An-Nur, God is the light of the heavens and the earth, etc. The semblance of his light is like a glittering star, fueled from a blessed olive tree, from neither east nor west, whose oil almost gives light, even when no fire touches it, light upon light. Right? So he's basically saying that the drowning of the spirit in remembrance annihilates it and becomes like the oil that gives light, right? Even though fire doesn't touch it, right? So this is he's making an elusive indication to the reality of the ruh, right? Which is a reality that's very difficult to actually comprehend by the human mind, right? So this conversation about dhikr, very important, of course. And Shaykh Ibrahim has elaborated it on this subject previously, but his reference to the idea of the shell and the core of the core of dhikr requires some further elaboration. So I'm going to refer very quickly to the removal of confusion. As I said, this was his first and his most comprehensive elaboration of the Sufi tradition. And here he quotes an 18th century Mauritanian scholar, Sheikh Muhammad al-Yadali, probably from the Shazaliya Sufi order, dies in 1753. And this Sheikh Yadali is really elaborating upon this idea that Shaykh Ibrahim really likes. So he includes the quote, and I'll read it. He says, "Know that the masters of spiritual insight have discovered that the remembrance is the best of all good deeds, but it has three husks. However, one nearer to the core than the other, and underneath the three husks is the core. The merit of the husks or the shells is only due to there being a path to the core. The outer husk is the remembrance of the tongue alone. The middle husk is the remembrance of the heart." And then he says there's actually two parts of this. That's why there's three husks. So there's two parts of the remembrance of the heart under obligation, and then the heart that's obedient. And last, he says, is the sought after core. This is where the servant is not concerned with directing the heart's attention to the remembrance or the heart itself. He is only absorbed by the one who is remembered. Whatever appears to him in the course of this that may divert his attention is a veil to be overcome. The Gnostics refer to this last condition as annihilation, fana. You see how Shaykh Ibrahim is applying fana to all levels here. It's fana because the servant has become extinct to himself. He is not conscious of the externals of his material form, nor of his internal disturbances. He has become absent from all of this, and all of this has become absent from him. So he proceeds to his Lord from the beginning to the end. Should his own annihilation appear to him in the course thereof, this represents a blemish and a vexation. Perfect annihilation entails the extinction from the self, and then extinction from the extinction. So annihilation from annihilation is the ultimate form of annihilation. This is the fruit of the core of remembrance. The first stage of the remembrance is that of the tongue, then the remembrance of the heart under obligation, then the remembrance of the obedient heart, then the servant's occupation by the one remembered, and the erasure of the remembrance. As long as the heart is conscious of the remembrance, it is actually turned away from Allah. The heart is not rid of hidden polytheism, shirk, until it comes to be totally absorbed by the one, the real. So this is the true doctrine of oneness. This is the true tawheed. The same might be said of gnosis. For if someone is seeking gnosis, he has expressed duality. Whoever finds gnosis, it is as if he did not find it. Gnosis is found by none except by the one who is known. So he is the one who encompasses the reality of communion, wasal, and the arrival of his loved one in the presence of holiness. Right? And so basically he goes on to explain that the semblance of this is if you have encountered your lover, right? And you are so in love with this person that you could be watching her or him, and somebody would pass in front of you, maybe speak to you, and although you're cognizant of that other person speaking or passing in front of you, you're not concerned at all with them, right? You're just completely enraptured in the love of that lover. But if you were to come out and say, well, actually, isn't it great? This state feels really good. I'm actually really so in love with my lover. Then your daddy is saying you're not actually in love with your lover. You're in love with the love of your lover, right? So this is what he means by fana min al fana. You have to have extinction from your extinction, because once you go into extinction, you cannot notice it anymore, right? Because if you do, then you're no longer in the state of annihilation of yourself. You're actually coming back to yourself. So this is what he means here, and of course he's talking about a state of remembrance that actually starts to move into the conversation of contemplation. So we'll get there in a minute. But one other relevant quote from the Kashf is quoting a scholar named Abu Abbas al-Banat, whom I haven't been able to identify. But it seems that Shaykh Ibrahim is quoting from a handwritten manuscript that he has found from him. But it's a very arresting quote. So he says, among the greatest forms of remembrance is that which arises from inspiration received from the one who is remembered. Magnificent is his remembrance. According to the Sufis, this is the hidden remembrance, made continuously and in secret. As for the saying, to the point one making the remembrance masters a state of immersion beyond remembrance, this mastery is neither a state of incarnation nor a theosophical union. La hulul wa la ittihad. Only a faculty obtained from him who is almighty and wise. The explanation of this is that the heart becomes, in the presence of the remembrance, empty of the entirety of existence, so that nothing remains in it other than Allah. Mighty is his remembrance. The heart thus becomes the house of the manifest truth. Allah becomes the tongue with which the servant speaks. If one possessing such a heart were to strike a blow, he would be the hand with which he strikes. If he hears, he is the hearing with which he hears. Of course, this is the Hadith Qudsi that you know. The Exalted One, being remembered, has taken possession of the heart, so he controls it. He has taken possession of the limbs of the body, so he uses them for what is pleasing to him. He has taken possession of all the attributes of this servant, so he alternates them however he wills for his pleasure. For this reason, the remembrance emerges without any effort. Good deeds and obedience are undertaken with cheerful animation and delight, rather than as a wearisome burden. Such is Allah's bounty. He bestows it on whom he wills, and Allah, Zul Fadl Azim, is the owner of infinite bounty. And so often the question becomes, of course, especially when we talked about this previous Hadith Qudsi, Man shaghal al-Quran wa zikri an saltani wa atihu khayru man yu'ati sa'ilin. Whoever is preoccupied with the Quran and the remembrance, from asking me anything, I give him better than what the people ask are given. And so often mentioned in this regard is the idea, well, du'a al-mukhil ibadah, right? That the supplication or asking Allah is the brain or the mind of worship, right? And that the Prophet ﷺ has encouraged the believers to increase their supplication. And indeed, Allah has said that he answers the prayers of those who ask him for things, right? And the Prophet ﷺ said you should ask Allah for everything, even your own shoelace. All right? And basically the conversation, Ibrahim says it as well, that it's no different from Allah to ask to give you a shoelace than it is for him to give you $1 billion, right? So ask him all of your needs, big and small. And so the explanation how to sort of reconcile, square this circle here, is that basically they're just different types of asking, right? And so what this passage by Abu Abbas al-Bana is pointing out here is that if you forego asking Allah for anything, you're only asking Allah, in other words, for his essential being. And that if you get to the point where your whole being, your ruh, your qalb, your heart, your tongue are completely absorbed in the remembrance of Allah, then Allah will actually take over you, right? And he'll take over your hand, your tongue, your eyes. And Allah, in other words, Allah will become so close to you that, and yes, you will find yourself in the world, right? You'll find yourself needing things in the world, speaking, but that type of baqa, the baqa ba'ad al-fana, right? The remaining in the world after annihilation, means that your dua is much different, right? And this, we said, is the station of tasrif, because you have become annihilated from your own personal volition, your own personal desires, and you only want what Allah wants. And if you want what Allah wants, then surely whatever you want will come to be, right? And there's always a famous story related in this regard about one Sufi, and this is reported in the Tijani sources as well, but also earlier, one Sufi who says to somebody else, my kingdom is greater than Allah's kingdom. And some of the ulama said, how can you say that? That's blasphemous, right? So they go to put him on trial, and he says, well, didn't Allah say that if you are for me, then I am for you? And is not Allah greater than his kingdom? So I am for Allah, then Allah is for me, then what I have is greater than Allah's kingdom, because I have Allah himself, right? As Hadith Qudsi, I who cannot fit into universe upon universe, fit into the heart of the sincere believer, right? So you will never lose, then, Shaykh Ibrahim is saying, by just allowing yourself or pushing yourself or having the loftiest aspiration to have annihilation in Allah's essence. So how does he talk about tafakkur, contemplation? Because I think you can see here by these quotations of remembrance that basically you're attaining a state that's actually beyond the remembrance, right? Your daddy says you come to a place where the remembrance itself is erased, right? And so this is what Shaykh Ibrahim, he wants to talk about with tafakkur, with this verse, that those people who remember Allah standing, sitting on their sides and contemplate, that they make tafakkur, that they contemplate Allah and his creation. So he relates the hadith. He says, contemplation, tafakkur, for a moment is better than worship for 1 year, right? So we have conflicting narrations about this idea of contemplation. One is that it's important to contemplate Allah, as this one relates, but also that one should not contemplate Allah's essence, but rather contemplate his works, right? Contemplate the creation. Because the human mind cannot actually understand an infinite being, right? So Shaykh says, yes, contemplation for a moment is better than worship for 1 year. He says contemplation is better than worship because worship is an action of the body, while reflection or contemplation is an action of the heart. Worship is from the servant, contemplation is a gift from Allah. And I think you can understand now with the successive stages of annihilation and the remembrance. Now you have a state beyond the remembrance of the tongue, in which you are just left with the remembrance. You're just left with Allah himself. He said, you will find certain people who worship Allah through contemplation. Shiraim says, they will spend the whole night without having performed a single cycle of prayer. Their worship instead consists in contemplation. Right? And so here he relates several stories. One is about Imam al-Shafi going to visit Abu Hanifa. Whether this is legend or actually happened, it's not important. It's a teaching story, right? So the story is that Abu Hanifa used to spend half the night in prayer until he heard somebody talking about him as he was passing by, and they were saying, oh, Abu Hanifa is so righteous. I heard he prays all night. And so then Abu Hanifa felt bad that they were saying something better than he was actually doing. So then he started to spend all of his night making, extra rak'ah, extra prayers. Imam al-Shafi goes to visit him, and Abu Hanifa has a daughter who, is obviously cognizant of what her father is doing. And so he says, well, I've heard my father speak about Imam al-Shafi. He's this great scholar. So I'm going to kind of spy on him at night and see what he does. And so in the morning, she comes to her father, and Imam al-Shafi is actually listening. He says, who is this man you brought into the house? He's worthless. Like, he doesn't do anything. He spent the whole night not doing this. He's not sitting there. I don't even sleeping and what he's doing. And the time for prayer came for the Fajr prayer, and he got up to pray. He didn't even have wudu. He didn't have ablution. And so Imam Shafi heard her and started to laugh and says, actually, I spent the whole night in tafakkur and reflection and contemplation. And so I did not sleep. And so when I got up to pray the prayer, I still had wudu. Right? And so this is, so another story that Shaykh Ibrahim relates here is of the Prophet ﷺ one day coming to spend the night with Aisha, anha, and it's obviously her night to be with him. So she says, but he says to her, if you permit, I'd like to spend the night with my Lord. And she said, well, I only desire to be closer to you, but if that's what you want, then I give you permission, right? So the story is that the Prophet got up to make the ablution, and then he just sat down and he started to weep. And then he laid down and he kept weeping until the tears, drenched his shirt and then fell onto the floor. And so Bilal, Sayyidina Bilal, the Muazzin, of course, came in closer to Fajr to check on the Prophet and found him in tears. And he said, basically, what's wrong? What is this? And why are you crying? That Allah has forgiven you your past, anything you did before and after. And so this is the Prophet says, well, should I not be Abdun Shakur? Should I not be a grateful servant? And how can I not do this? He goes on to say, well, the following verse has been revealed to me tonight, and they contemplate the creations of the heavens and the earth, right? The one we just read. So the result of the revelation of this verse for the Prophet is that he spent the night in tearful contemplation of his Lord. And so it's of course reminiscent of, there's a story of Shaykh Ahmad Tijani during the month of Ramadan, and this is in the book Ifadat al-Ahmadiyya, where somebody who comes to visit Shaykh Ahmad Tijani, he's not a disciple, but he wanted to go visit him. So he goes to visit him, and it's around the suhoor time, right before people start fasting, and they're having their breakfast. And he comes, and then he doesn't like what he sees, so he goes away. And then somebody asked him, why did you leave so soon? He said, well, I've heard so many good things about Shaykh Ahmad Tijani, but when I came to see them, I found that he's sitting there eating food and he's talking with his people, and they're talking about worldly affairs and whatever they want, and they're laughing. I don't remember the exact narration, but they're basically, he found them as if he would find anybody else. So he said, well, there's nothing really special about Shaykh Ahmad Tijani. So the man's opinion is related to Shaykh Ahmad Tijani, and Shaykh Ahmad Tijani said, okay, everyone who works has his works. There's everybody who does his worship. It belongs to them, and may Allah accept from him. Right? He said obligatory worship or supererogatory, but he says Allah gives us and our companions for each work more than 100,000 times what he gives to another, and this while resting. Right? So one of the ways of understanding this is that Shaykh Ahmad Tijani is talking about this station of tafakkur, of contemplation, right? That's actually better than worship, right? It's worth a year's, one moment is worth a year's worth of worship, right? Now, of course, the best would be to combine worship in contemplation, right? And Shaykh Ahmad Tijani is, of course, very much known for this as well. So it's not as if the Shaykh Ahmad Tijani was only making tafakkur and never, he was making khalwa. We know about many of the prayers and dhikr and ahzab and awrad that he's reading on a regular basis. But the state here is that of Ali ibn Abi Talib, of course, when one day he says publicly, verily I make 50 extra rak'ahs, cycles of prayer every night. And then somebody says to him kind of on the side, Sayyidina Ali, aren't you afraid of huburiyah? Like, afraid of showing off, or being seen of showing off? And he says, who is there to be seen in the worship from the beginning to end except for Allah, right? Meaning that I'm the one performing the prayer, but my heart is in a state of contemplation. That Allah is sort of using my body to pray, right? So what does Shaykh Ibrahim say about contemplation? So contemplation then has this privileged place that is actually better than dhikr. It's actually better than worship, right? Because Shaykh Ibrahim, he says, it's the heart of worship, right? If you're just moving your body, but you're not having a contemplation of Allah, then you're not really worshiping Allah the way you could. So he says, Shaykh Ibrahim says in further tafsir of this verse, the contemplation of the common folk is the reflection on the creation of Allah, and to derive evidence from it for the Creator. Right? The contemplation of the spiritual elite is on Allah's essential being. Contemplation of Allah's essential being is prohibited, as we said, for the common people, for they are incapable of fathoming Allah's being, which has no place, no explanation, no feet, no head, and no hands. Should the common person think about this, he will simply render our Lord as a watermelon in his mind, and thereby fall into something blameworthy. But for the elite, they may contemplate the essential being of Allah, and for them is the narration, an hour's contemplation is better than a year's worship. And it has also been narrated, an hour's contemplation is better than 7 years of worship. And it has been, and it has also been narrated, an hour's contemplation is better than 70 years of worship. For each station, there is a relevant statement. Likuli maqam maqal, Shaykh Ibrahim says, right? So he seems to be sort of subtly indicating that the different narrations are applicable to different types of tafakkur, different types of contemplation. The contemplation on Allah's works is worth a year of worship. Contemplation of Allah's attributes is worth 7 years of worship, and contemplation on Allah's essence is worth 70 years of worship. Wallahu a'lam. Okay, that's all I have for this session. I know it was a bit longer, so my apologies for that. But again, the essential thing is to sort of recognize that the ma'rifah, the knowledge, that the purpose of the Quran is to teach ma'rifah, to teach the knowledge of God, that the knowledge of God exists, is a type of monotheism or tawheed that exists on 3 levels: the knowledge of Allah's essence, the knowledge of His attributes, and the knowledge of His works. And that this is, and so that ma'rifah itself is an essential aspect of one's tawheed, of one's ability not to associate partners with God, right? And of course, if you are seeing that there is another in creation that has the same power of Allah, then you're associating partners with Allah at the level of works, right? If you are thinking that there's another in creation that has rahmah, that has mercy for the creation like Allah has for the creation, then you are guilty of associating partners with Allah at the level of attributes, right? And if you are thinking of Allah's essence in any way that's unbecoming of His majesty, then you are associating partners, right? If you actually think that God has a hand like you have a hand, or sits in a chair like you sit in a chair, right? Then your monotheism, your tawheed at the level of Allah's essence is shaky, right? Is not correct. So for Shaykh Ibrahim says, this is why mahma kan al-hijab فذلك النوع من العقاب, right? So anytime there's or نوع من العذاب, anytime that there's a type of any veil between you and Allah and understanding His oneness, then there's a type of punishment, right? That you are prone to, that you are open to because of your inability to have true knowledge of Tawheed at that level, right? So this is the urgency that Shaykh Ibrahim says, not just a nice state that we're looking for, but we want to have the ma'rifah of Allah to know our Lord, and we need to know our Lord, right? Okay. وآخر دعاءنا إن الحمد لله رب العالمين. السلام عليكم for now.